The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Dr. Victoria Chen silenced it with the practiced efficiency of someone whose internal clock had long since synchronized with necessity, rather than desire. In the small apartment above Chen's Corner Cafe, she moved through her morning routine with the precision that had once made her one of the most sought-after cardiac surgeons on the West Coast. Coffee first, always coffee first. The beans were imported from a small farm in Guatemala, roasted to her exact specifications by a company in Seattle that probably thought she was obsessive about caffeine. They had no idea that the ritual of grinding beans, measuring water temperature, and timing the extraction process served as a form of meditation, a way to center herself before facing another day of careful invisibility. At 38, Victoria had perfected the art of being unremarkable in Millbrook, Montana, a mountain town of 2,847 people where everyone knew everyone's business, except hers. Her dark hair was always pulled back in the same practical ponytail, secured with an elastic band that had seen better days. She dressed in the uniform of deliberate ordinariness: well-worn jeans, comfortable sneakers that had been white once upon a time, and whatever clean shirt emerged first from her limited wardrobe. The face that looked back at her from the bathroom mirror each morning showed the subtle changes that 3 years of mountain air and reduced stress had brought. The lines around her eyes had softened, though they'd been earned through means she preferred not to remember. Her hands, once steady enough to perform microsurgery on infant hearts, now showed the minor calluses and small scars of manual labor: burns from oven racks, cuts from broken coffee cups, the honest wear of honest work. By 5 a.m., Victoria was downstairs in the cafe, moving through the opening routine that had become as natural as breathing. Lights on, coffee machines warming, ovens preheated to the precise temperatures required for the day's baking. The pastries were made fresh every morning, a standard she'd maintained since opening despite the extra work it required. Old habits died hard, and the perfectionism that had once driven her to spend 18 hours perfecting a surgical technique now manifested in ensuring that every blueberry muffin was exactly the right shade of golden brown. The cafe itself reflected Victoria's personality more than she realized. Clean lines, efficient layout, everything in its proper place. 12 tables of varying sizes accommodated the morning rush, lunch crowd, and afternoon coffee drinkers. The counter featured 6 stools that provided front-row seats to watch Victoria work, though few customers realized they were observing someone whose hands had once held human hearts. Chen's Corner Cafe occupied the ground floor of a 2-story brick building on Main Street, squeezed between Murphy's hardware store and the Book Nook, Millbrook's combination bookstore, and unofficial town meeting place. The location had been chosen carefully, visible enough to attract customers, central enough to serve the community, but not so prominent as to invite unwanted scrutiny. The equipment in Victoria's kitchen would have surprised anyone who understood commercial food service. The espresso machine was the Italian import that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The ovens were professional grade, the refrigeration system restaurant quality, and the knife set would have been at home in a 5-star establishment. Victoria had told anyone who asked that she believed in using good tools, which was true as far as it went. What she hadn't mentioned was that precision instruments were a necessity for someone trained to understand that millimeters could mean the difference between life and death. Her regular customers had established patterns that Victoria could set her watch by. Henry Murphy, 67, owner of the hardware store next door, arrived every morning at 6 a.m. sharp for black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He sat at the same stool, read the same sections of the newspaper in the same order, and left exactly the right change, plus a 15% tip. Henry had been trying to retire for 5 years, but kept putting it off because he couldn't find anyone willing to take over the store. Sarah Thompson, 34, the town librarian, came in during her lunch break 3 days a week. She ordered a cappuccino and whatever sandwich was the daily special, then spent exactly 45 minutes reading at the corner table by the window. Sarah was working on a novel about small-town secrets, though she didn't know that Victoria had noticed the notebook filled with character descriptions and plot outlines. Tom Bradley, 42, volunteer fire chief and full-time insurance agent, stopped by whenever his schedule allowed. His order varied depending on his stress level. Regular coffee with cream when things were calm, black coffee with an extra shot when emergencies were brewing. Tom had the observational skills of someone who'd spent 15 years responding to crises, and Victoria suspected he'd noticed more about her background than he let on. Dr. James Peterson, 73, the town's only physician, came in twice a week for tea and conversation. He was fighting a losing battle against arthritis and the growing realization that Millbrook needed younger medical professionals to serve its aging population. Doc Peterson carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd spent 40 years being the person others turned to in their worst moments. These relationships, carefully maintained at exactly the right distance, formed the structure of Victoria's new life. Friendly enough to avoid suspicion, distant enough to prevent real intimacy. She knew their orders, remembered their preferences, asked polite questions about their lives, and never, ever volunteered information about her own past. The transformation from Dr. Victoria Chen to Victoria the cafe owner hadn't happened overnight. 3 years ago, she'd arrived in Millbrook with a broken heart, a ruined reputation, and enough money to start over somewhere no one would think to look for a disgraced surgeon. The legal name change had been finalized in Seattle, along with the hair color change that had taken her from brunette to auburn and somehow made her entire face look different. She'd spent 2 months learning to run a commercial kitchen, taking classes at a culinary school in Missoula under her new identity. The other students assumed she was a career changer seeking a more fulfilling life, which was true in ways they couldn't imagine. Learning to bake bread and steam milk was vastly different from performing coronary bypasses, but both required attention to detail, precise timing, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The cafe had been a natural choice for several reasons. Food service was honest work that served a genuine community need. The hours were predictable but not rigid. Most importantly, running a small business required exactly the kind of organizational skills and crisis management abilities that Victoria possessed in abundance, while allowing her to use those skills in ways that wouldn't attract attention. In 3 years, she'd built a reputation as a reliable business owner, a skilled baker, and a friendly but private person. The townspeople had long since stopped asking pointed questions about her past. Some probably assumed she was running from a bad marriage or recovering from some personal tragedy. Others might have suspected financial problems or family issues. None had guessed that the woman who made their morning coffee had once been written up in medical journals and invited to speak at international conferences. The carefully constructed life Victoria had built in Millbrook was about to be tested by forces beyond her control. Weather in the mountains was notoriously unpredictable, and this particular October had been unusually wet. The seasonal rains had been heavier than normal, the snowpack in the high country was melting faster than expected, and the Millbrook River was running higher than anyone could remember. Victoria had noticed the signs before most others. Years of medical training had taught her to pay attention to subtle changes, to recognize patterns that others might miss. The atmospheric pressure shifts that made her old injuries ache, the way animals behave differently before major weather events, the particular quality of light that preceded serious storms. On Monday morning, October 15th, she woke to the sound of rain against her bedroom window. Not the gentle mountain drizzle that was common this time of year, but the steady, purposeful drumming of a weather system that meant business. By the time she made it downstairs to open the cafe, the rain had intensified to the point where she could barely see across Main Street. The morning routine proceeded normally despite the weather. Henry Murphy arrived at 6 a.m. wearing a rain slicker that had seen better decades, shaking water off like an old dog. "Hell of a storm brewing," he commented, settling onto his usual stool. "Haven't seen it come down like this since '98. Victoria poured his coffee and arranged his muffin on the plate, her movements automatic while her mind processed the reference. She'd researched Millbrook's history when she first arrived, including the flood of 1998 that had caused significant damage to the lower part of town. If Henry was comparing current conditions to that event, the situation might be more serious than it appeared. "River's running pretty high," she observed, keeping her tone conversational while fishing for more information. Henry nodded grimly. "Tom Bradley was out checking the gauges this morning. Said it's already at levels we don't usually see until spring runoff. If this keeps up..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Throughout the morning, Victoria noticed an undercurrent of tension among her customers. Conversations were subdued, people checked their phones more frequently, and several regulars mentioned canceling plans due to the weather. The rain continued with relentless intensity, turning Main Street into a shallow river and forcing pedestrians to wade through water that reached their ankles. Tom Bradley arrived at 10:30 a.m., earlier than usual, and wearing the grim expression Victoria had learned to associate with developing emergencies. His uniform was soaked despite the rain gear, and his radio crackled intermittently with emergency traffic. "Coffee black, double shot," he ordered, not bothering with pleasantries. Victoria prepared his drink with extra care, adding a splash of cream without being asked. Tom needed the calories more than he needed the caffeine, though he probably didn't realize it. "Long morning?" "Getting longer by the minute," Tom replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "River's up another 2 feet since dawn. If it keeps rising at this rate, we're going to have problems." "What kind of problems?" Tom studied her face for a moment, as if weighing how much information to share. "The low-lying areas near the elementary school flood first. We've got protocols for evacuation, but..." He paused, listening to his radio as dispatch coordinated with various emergency services. Victoria felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation she'd once experienced when entering an operating room where everything was about to go wrong. But we're a volunteer department with limited resources, and Doc Peterson's the only medical professional in a 50-mile radius. If people get hurt, if we need to set up an emergency shelter, if this turns into a real disaster..." Tom didn't finish the thought, but Victoria understood. Small towns like Millbrook functioned on the assumption that serious emergencies happened to other people. The volunteer fire department was equipped to handle house fires, minor traffic accidents, and medical calls that could wait for transport to the hospital in Kalispell. A major flood was beyond their normal operational capacity. "How can I help?" The words were out of Victoria's mouth before she could stop them, revealing more about her background than she'd intended. Tom raised an eyebrow. "Most people ask what they should do to protect themselves. You're asking how you can help others." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks, realizing she'd slipped into the mindset that had once made her an exceptional surgeon. The automatic assumption that she had skills and knowledge that could be useful in a crisis. "I just meant, if you need someone to help coordinate supplies, or provide shelter, or..." "Actually," Tom said slowly, "there is something. We might need to set up an emergency shelter if the evacuation orders come down. The community center's the designated location, but we'd need people who can stay calm under pressure, help coordinate activities, maybe assist with basic first aid." Victoria nodded, careful to keep her expression neutral. "I can do that." As Tom finished his coffee and prepared to leave, his radio erupted with urgent chatter. Victoria caught fragments of the transmission. water over the road, stranded vehicle, possible injuries. Tom's expression hardened as he listened to the details. "Victoria," he said, standing and leaving money on the counter, "you might want to close early today. This is going to get worse before it gets better." After Tom left, Victoria stood alone in the cafe, listening to the rain pound against the windows with increasing violence. The few remaining customers finished their drinks and hurried out into the storm, leaving her with a decision she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She could close the cafe, go upstairs to her apartment, and wait for the storm to pass. She could remain Victoria, the cafe owner, uninvolved and safe from the kind of responsibilities that had once destroyed her life. Or she could acknowledge what her training and instincts were telling her, that this situation was going to require every available person with useful skills to step forward. The choice, when it came, wasn't really a choice at all. By noon, the rain had transformed from merely heavy to genuinely dangerous. Victoria stood at the cafe window, watching water rush down Main Street with a force that suggested the storm drains were completely overwhelmed. The hardware store across the street was already showing water damage at ground level, and she could see Henry Murphy moving inventory to higher shelves with the methodical urgency of someone who'd been through this before. Her radio, an emergency scanner she'd purchased shortly after moving to Millbrook, crackled with increasing frequency. The volunteer fire department was coordinating with county emergency services. The sheriff's department was reporting multiple road closures, and the National Weather Service had upgraded the flood warning to life-threatening. Victoria made her decision with the same clinical detachment she'd once used when facing surgical complications. She locked the front door, turned off the main coffee machines, and began preparing the cafe for potential use as an emergency staging area. The tables could be moved to create space. The kitchen had commercial equipment for preparing large quantities of food, and the building sat on high enough ground to remain accessible even if the lower areas flooded. As she worked, Victoria allowed herself to acknowledge something she'd been suppressing for 3 years. She missed being useful in emergencies. The adrenaline surge that came with crisis management, the satisfaction of applying specialized knowledge to save lives, the sense of purpose that transcended personal concerns. Running a cafe was honest work, but it didn't challenge her in the same way that emergency medicine had. Her phone rang at 12:30 p.m. Tom Bradley's voice was tense but controlled. "Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Do you have medical training?" The question she'd been dreading for 3 years, asked by someone who'd earned the right to an honest response. Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of careful deception. "Some," she admitted carefully. "Why?" "Because we've got a situation developing and Doc Peterson's stuck on the wrong side of a washed-out bridge. The community center's flooding, and we're moving the evacuation center to the high school. We've got 43 people who need shelter, and at least a dozen with various injuries. I need someone who can handle medical emergencies until we can get proper help." Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she processed the implications. 43 people meant families, children, elderly residents with chronic conditions. Various injuries could mean anything from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. Without proper medical support, people could die. "What kind of injuries?" she asked, her voice automatically shifting to the calm, professional tone she'd once used in emergency rooms. "Minor stuff mostly. Cuts from broken glass, a possible broken wrist, hypothermia concerns. But Victoria, if this gets worse, if people start getting seriously hurt." Tom's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Victoria stared out at the storm, weighing the risks of exposure against the certainty that people needed help. She'd spent 3 years hiding from responsibility, but some obligations transcended personal safety. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. "What medical supplies do you have?" Basic first aid kit, some blankets, whatever people brought with them. Not much for anything serious. Victoria was already moving, gathering items from her apartment that she'd hoped never to use again. The medical bag she'd maintained despite no longer practicing, antibiotics that hadn't expired, pain medication prescribed for her own injuries but never used, emergency supplies for emergencies she'd prayed would never come. Tom, I need you to do something for me. Set up a triage area near the entrance, somewhere I can assess people as they come in. Separate the walking wounded from anyone who needs immediate attention. And keep people calm. Fear spreads faster than injury in confined spaces. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Victoria, you sound like you've done this before. She had done this before, in hospital emergency rooms, field hospitals, and disaster zones where her surgical skills had meant the difference between life and death. But those days were supposed to be behind her. I'll see you at the school, she said, ending the call before Tom could ask more questions. The drive to Millbrook High School was treacherous, with Victoria's aging Honda struggling through water that reached halfway up the tires. She passed stranded vehicles, downed power lines, and debris that suggested the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights moved through the streets like ghosts in the storm, their sirens barely audible over the howling wind. The high school sat on elevated ground at the edge of town, built in the 1970s when federal funding had allowed for more ambitious public works projects. The parking lot was already filled with emergency vehicles, personal cars, and school buses that had been pressed into service for evacuations. Emergency lights painted everything in alternating reds and blues, creating a surreal disco effect against the gray storm clouds. Inside the main gymnasium, controlled chaos reigned. Volunteers were setting up cots, organizing supplies, and trying to manage nearly 50 displaced residents with varying degrees of distress. Children cried, adults argued about logistics, and everyone seemed to be talking at once. The sound echoed off the gymnasium walls, creating a cacophony that would have been overwhelming under normal circumstances. Tom Bradley spotted Victoria immediately, his relief evident despite the professional composure he maintained. Thank God you're here. We've got a situation developing with Mrs. Patterson. Chest pains, difficulty breathing. Could be a heart attack. Victoria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once carried her through the most complex surgeries. The noise, confusion, and mounting crisis faded into background as her medical training took over. She moved through the crowd with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged in emergency situations. Eleanor Patterson, 71, sat on a folding chair near the makeshift first aid station, her face gray with pain and fear. Victoria knelt beside her, automatically checking pulse and breathing while maintaining the calming presence that had once made her a favorite among nervous patients. Mrs. Patterson, I'm Victoria Chen. I'm here to help. Can you tell me about the pain you're experiencing? Eleanor's voice was weak but clear. Started about 20 minutes ago. Feels like someone's sitting on my chest. My left arm's tingling, and I can't seem to catch my breath. Classic symptoms of cardiac distress, possibly a heart attack in progress. Victoria's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Eleanor's pulse, observing her color, noting the subtle signs that indicated how serious the situation might be. The woman's pulse was irregular, her skin was clammy, and her breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Tom, Victoria said quietly, I need you to call for emergency transport immediately. Tell them we have a 71-year-old female with possible myocardial infarction in progress. They need to prioritize this call. Tom stared at her for a moment, processing the medical terminology that had slipped out with unconscious authority. Victoria, how do you know? Just make the call, she interrupted, already reaching into her medical bag for the aspirin and nitroglycerin she'd hoped never to use. And clear some space around us. I need room to work." What followed was a masterclass in emergency cardiac care delivered in a high school gymnasium with improvised equipment. Victoria administered aspirin to thin Eleanor's blood, provided oxygen from the school's athletic emergency kit, and monitored her vital signs with the precision of someone who'd handled hundreds of similar cases. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who'd spent 3 years invisibly serving coffee was suddenly the most competent person in the room, moving with confidence and authority that couldn't be faked. Other volunteers stepped back, unconsciously deferring to her expertise. "Eleanor, you're having a heart attack," Victoria explained calmly, using the direct honesty that patients needed in crisis situations. "It's serious, but we're going to take good care of you. I need you to stay calm and let me know if anything changes." The ambulance arrived 25 minutes later, the paramedics struggling through flooded streets to reach the school. Victoria briefed them with the professional efficiency of someone who'd handed off patients to transport crews countless times before. 71-year-old female, anterior wall MI in progress, she reported. Administered 325 milligrams aspirin, sublingual nitroglycerin, oxygen at 4 liters. Vitals stable but guarded. She'll need immediate cardiac catheterization. The lead paramedic, a weathered man named Rodriguez, who'd been working emergency medicine for 15 years, stared at Victoria with growing recognition. "Ma'am, are you medical personnel?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'm a doctor." The admission rippled through the nearby volunteers like a shockwave. Tom Bradley's eyes widened with understanding, while other emergency workers began reassessing the quiet cafe owner they thought they knew. As the ambulance departed with Eleanor Patterson, Victoria found herself surrounded by people with injuries, concerns, and questions. Word had spread quickly through the gymnasium that there was a real doctor present, and suddenly, everyone remembered problems that needed professional attention. Jerry Collins, 45, had injured his wrist while securing plywood over his store windows. The joint was swollen and misaligned in a way that suggested fracture rather than sprain. Victoria examined it with gentle precision, her fingers reading the damage like familiar text. "It's broken," she told him matter-of-factly. "Clean fracture of the radius. We need to immobilize it properly until you can get to a hospital for x-rays and casting." She improvised a splint using materials from the gymnasium's first aid supplies, padding from athletic equipment, and elastic bandages that someone had donated. Her hands moved with unconscious expertise, creating an immobilization device that was better than what many emergency rooms would have provided. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked Susan Martinez, one of the volunteer coordinators, watching Victoria work with obvious amazement. "Medical school," Victoria replied simply, focusing on securing the splint properly. "A long time ago." As she worked, Victoria became aware that she was drawing attention from throughout the gymnasium. People were watching her with the mixture of curiosity and respect that she'd once taken for granted. Children who'd been crying earlier now sat quietly, somehow sensing that the presence of a real doctor made them safer. The afternoon progressed with a steady stream of medical issues that Victoria handled with increasing confidence. A teenage boy with asthma whose inhaler had been lost in the evacuation. An elderly man showing early signs of hypothermia. A pregnant woman concerned about the stress of displacement on her unborn child. Each case reinforced something Victoria had been denying for 3 years. She was exceptional at emergency medicine. Her hands remembered procedures, her mind automatically prioritized problems, and her presence calmed both patients and other volunteers. The skills that had once made her a renowned surgeon were intact, refined by years of experience and sharpened by the challenge of working with limited resources. Tom Bradley watched from across the gymnasium, his expression cycling through amazement, gratitude, and growing suspicion. During a brief lull in medical emergencies, he approached Victoria with the direct manner that had made him an effective emergency coordinator. "Victoria, we need to talk," he said quietly. "Not just some medical training. You're handling this like you've run emergency departments before." Victoria looked around the gymnasium, noting the organized chaos of disaster response, the way volunteers were naturally organizing themselves around her medical station, the calm that had settled over the evacuees since her arrival. For the first time in 3 years, she felt useful in a way that transcended serving coffee and making conversation. "Tom, there are things about my background that I haven't shared," she admitted carefully. "But right now, what matters is taking care of these people." Before Tom could respond, his radio erupted with urgent chatter. Victoria caught fragments of the transmission that made her blood run cold. "School bus, Miller Road, children trapped, water rising." Tom's face went white as he listened to the full report. A school bus carrying 12 children from an after-school program had become stranded on Miller Road, the driver attempting to reach higher ground before the evacuation order came through. The bus was now surrounded by rapidly rising water, tilted at a dangerous angle where the road had been washed out. "How far is Miller Road?" Victoria asked, her medical instincts already shifting to trauma preparation. 10 minutes in good weather," Tom replied grimly. "Might be impassable now. The current's running strong enough to sweep vehicles downstream." Victoria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once carried her through the most challenging surgeries. 12 children in immediate danger, emergency responders stretched beyond their limits, and conditions that would test every skill she'd ever learned. "What rescue resources do you have?" she asked, her voice carrying new authority. Tom stared at her, recognizing something in her tone that he couldn't quite identify. "Victoria, this isn't a medical emergency. This is search and rescue. It's dangerous as hell and requires specialized training that—" "Tom," she interrupted, meeting his gaze with the steady confidence she'd once used when taking charge of operating rooms. "I need you to trust me. What rescue resources do you have?" The volunteer fire department's rescue equipment was spread across a folding table in the school's lobby like surgical instruments awaiting operation. Ropes, carabiners, flotation devices, helmets, and emergency medical supplies that Victoria inventoried with the practiced eye of someone who'd prepared for complex procedures under time pressure. Tom Bradley watched her examine each piece of equipment, noting the way she tested rope strength, checked the integrity of safety gear, and automatically organized supplies in a logical progression. "Victoria, I need to know what kind of medical training you actually have. Lives depend on getting this right." The moment had come. Victoria looked at Tom's weathered face, saw the trust and desperation in his eyes, and made a decision that would shatter 3 years of careful anonymity. "Cardiac surgery," she said simply. "Johns Hopkins Medical School, residency at Mass General, fellowship in pediatric cardiac surgery. 8 years at Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco before—" She paused, the old pain still sharp enough to take her breath away. Before everything went wrong. Tom's expression shifted through several stages: surprise, recognition, and finally understanding. "Jesus Christ, you're not just a doctor, you're a surgeon. What the hell are you doing running a coffee shop in Montana?" "Right now, I'm trying to save 12 children," Victoria replied, shouldering a coil of rope with movements that suggested more experience with emergency equipment than any surgeon should possess. "We can discuss my career choices later." The drive to Miller Road was a nightmare of flooded pavement and debris-filled water. Tom's fire department truck could handle the conditions, but barely. Through the windshield, they could see trees bent by wind, power lines down across the road, and water running in directions that defied the normal geography of the area. "Radio traffic indicates the bus is stable for now," Tom reported, listening to updates from the scene. But water's rising fast. If it shifts position or if the current gets stronger. Victoria was already visualizing the rescue operation, her mind automatically breaking down the problem into manageable components. 12 children meant multiple trips or a mass evacuation system. Injured children would need immediate medical assessment. The bus driver and any accompanying adults would be prioritizing children's safety over their own, which meant they might be hiding their own injuries. "What's the age range of the children?" she asked, her medical training demanding information that would affect treatment decisions. "Elementary school aftercare program," Tom replied. "Probably 6 to 10 years old. God, Victoria, if we lose any of them." "We won't," Victoria said with the absolute certainty she'd once brought to families facing their worst nightmares. Some operations require precision rather than speed. This is one of them. Through the rain and darkness, they could see emergency lights marking the rescue site. The school bus sat at a crazy angle where Miller Road had been undermined by rushing water, tilted forward with its nose pointed toward the creek that had become a raging river. Water was already halfway up the windows, and they could see small faces pressed against the glass. Victoria stepped out of the truck into the storm, immediately assessing the tactical situation with the same systematic approach she'd once used when entering operating rooms where everything was going wrong. The bus was stable for now, but the water was rising. The current was too strong for waiting, but there were anchor points available for a rope-based rescue system. "Tom," she said, her voice cutting through the wind and rain with surgical precision, "I need you to establish an anchor point on that oak tree. Get the throwing rope ready. We're going to set up a zipline system to extract the children one at a time." "Victoria, that's incredibly dangerous," Tom protested, rain streaming down his face. "If someone falls in that current, if the anchor system fails—" 12 children die if we wait for perfect conditions," she replied, already moving toward the rescue equipment. "Sometimes the only way forward is through." The other volunteers at the scene, 3 firefighters, 2 sheriff's deputies, and a county emergency coordinator, watched with growing amazement as Victoria took charge of the rescue operation. She directed the rigging of safety lines with the confidence of someone who'd performed far more complex procedures under far worse conditions. "I'm going across first," she announced, securing a rescue harness with movements that suggested extensive experience with safety equipment. "The children will be frightened. They need to see that the system works before we ask them to trust it." Jim Patterson, the volunteer firefighter who'd arrived first on scene, shook his head. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but rescue operations like this require trained personnel. It's too dangerous for civilians." Victoria paused in her preparations, looking at Jim with the patient expression she'd once used when explaining complex procedures to nervous residents. "Jim, I'm a surgeon. I've performed operations where millimeters meant the difference between life and death. I've worked in field hospitals where the lights went out and the generators failed. Trust me when I say that I understand risk assessment." Before anyone could object further, Victoria clipped into the zipline system and pushed off from the bank. The crossing was smooth, her movement steady despite the howling wind and driving rain. She reached the bus in less than a minute, her professional composure intact despite the extraordinary circumstances. Inside the bus, chaos reigned with the particular intensity that only frightened children could generate. The driver, an elderly woman named Dorothy Walsh, was doing her best to keep everyone calm while fighting her own rising panic. The children ranged in age from 6 to 10, their faces pressed against windows as they watched the water continue to rise. "I'm Dr. Chen," Victoria announced, climbing through the emergency exit with calm authority. "We're going to get everyone out of here safely, but I need everyone to follow instructions exactly." The transformation was immediate. The presence of a real doctor, someone with obvious competence and unshakable confidence, calmed the children in ways that Dorothy's well-meaning reassurances couldn't match. Victoria moved through the tilted bus, quickly assessing each child for injuries while explaining the rescue process in terms they could understand. "We're going to play a game called Zipline Adventure," she told them, her voice carrying the warmth she'd once used with pediatric patients. "Each of you will wear a special harness, and I'll help you ride across the water to safety. It's going to be fun, but we need to be brave and follow all the safety rules." The rescue proceeded with methodical precision. Victoria secured each child in a rescue harness, provided reassurance and encouragement, then sent them across the zip line to the waiting volunteers. The smallest children rode with her, their complete trust both heartbreaking and empowering. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez was the most frightened, clinging to Victoria with desperate intensity. "I'm scared, Doctor. Chen. What if I fall?" "What?" Victoria knelt to Emma's eye level, using the gentle but confident tone that had once comforted children facing heart surgery. "Emma, I've sent 7 children across already, and every single one made it safely. You're going to ride with me, and I promise I won't let anything happen to you." As they crossed together, Emma's fear transformed into excitement. "This is like flying!" she shouted over the wind, her laughter audible even over the storm. Dorothy Walsh, the bus driver, insisted on going last, despite Victoria's concerns about her age and obvious exhaustion. "Been driving kids for 30 years, she said firmly. "I'm not leaving before they're all safe." As the final rescue was completed, the school bus shifted ominously and tilted further forward. Within minutes, it was completely submerged, swept away by the current like a yellow submarine returning to the depths. Victoria stood on solid ground, surrounded by 12 children who were alive because she'd chosen to step forward instead of staying hidden. Dorothy Walsh was being treated for hypothermia, but her vital signs were stable. The entire rescue had taken 43 minutes from start to finish. Tom Bradley approached her as she removed her safety gear, his expression cycling through admiration, confusion, and growing certainty that there was much more to Victoria's story than he'd imagined. "Victoria, that wasn't just medical training. You handled that rescue like you've done tactical operations before." She met his gaze steadily, water streaming from her hair, exhaustion beginning to set in as adrenaline faded. "Tom, there are parts of my background that I haven't shared with anyone in Millbrook. But right now, these children need to get warm and checked for injuries. We can discuss my qualifications later." As emergency vehicles transported the rescued children to the hospital for evaluation, Victoria found herself once again surrounded by people who needed medical attention. Word of the bus rescue had spread through the emergency response network, and her reputation was growing with each successful intervention. The pregnant woman from the evacuation center was having contractions that might indicate premature labor. An elderly man had fallen while helping with sandbagging operations and needed stitches. A volunteer firefighter was showing signs of exhaustion that bordered on medical emergency. With each case, Victoria felt more like herself than she had in 3 years. Her hands moved with remembered precision, her voice carried the authority of genuine expertise, and her presence created the kind of calm that only true competence could provide. But she also felt the weight of exposure. Too many people had seen her work, witnessed her skills, and begun asking questions that she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The careful anonymity she'd built in Millbrook was cracking like ice in spring, and she wasn't sure if that was liberation or disaster. The Millbrook High School gymnasium had been transformed into a field hospital by the time Victoria returned from the bus rescue. Cots were arranged in neat rows, medical supplies were organized on tables that had been commandeered from classrooms, and a sense of purposeful efficiency had replaced the earlier chaos. Victoria surveyed the scene with professional satisfaction, recognizing the signs of a well-managed emergency response. Dr. James Peterson sat in a wheelchair near the makeshift triage area, his face showing a mixture of relief and professional curiosity. At 73, he'd been Millbrook's only physician for 4 decades, but arthritis and age had limited his ability to handle physical emergencies. His presence provided medical authority, but his body could no longer match his expertise. "Dr. Chen," he said as Victoria approached, using her professional title with deliberate emphasis. "Tom Bradley filled me in on your background. Cardiac surgery, I hear." Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with exposure. "Former cardiac surgery, Dr. Peterson. I don't practice anymore." Peterson's weathered hands gestured toward the organized medical station, the efficiently treated patients, the calm atmosphere that pervaded the emergency shelter. "Could have fooled me. This is the best field medical operation I've seen in 40 years of rural practice." Word of Victoria's medical background had spread through the volunteer network with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Firefighters, sheriff's deputies, and emergency coordinators all found excuses to walk past the medical station, stealing glances at the woman who'd seamlessly transitioned from coffee shop owner to emergency physician. Sarah Thompson, the librarian, approached with obvious curiosity and concern. "Victoria, I had no idea you were a doctor. Why didn't you ever mention your medical background?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that Victoria had hoped to avoid for the rest of her life. She looked around at the faces watching her, people she'd served coffee to for 3 years, neighbors who'd accepted her as just another small-town business owner, friends who'd never suspected that their quiet cafe proprietor had once held human hearts in her hands. "It's complicated," Victoria said finally, the non-answer that had served her well for 3 years. But Tom Bradley, emboldened by the evening's revelations and the trust that had developed during the rescue operation, wasn't willing to accept evasion. "Victoria, you've just saved at least 20 lives tonight. You've demonstrated skills that go way beyond anything they teach in medical school. People have a right to know who you really are." The confrontation Victoria had dreaded for 3 years was finally happening, in front of an audience she'd come to care about, in circumstances that made denial impossible. She looked at the faces around her, genuine concern, growing admiration, and the kind of trust that she'd lost faith in after her professional destruction. "My name is Dr. Victoria Chen," she began, her voice carrying the steady authority that had once commanded operating rooms. "I was a cardiac surgeon at Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco. I specialized in pediatric cases, complex congenital repairs, procedures that other surgeons considered too risky to attempt." The admission created a ripple of surprise through the gathering crowd. Henry Murphy, who'd been receiving treatment for a minor cut, leaned forward with intense interest. "What happened? Why did you leave surgery?" Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of silence finally lifting. The story she'd never told anyone in Millbrook came out in precise clinical terms that couldn't entirely mask the pain behind them. 3 years ago, I was performing emergency surgery on a 6-year-old girl named Emily Patterson. She had multiple congenital heart defects, hypoplastic left heart syndrome with associated anomalies. The surgery was incredibly complex, requiring 8 hours of delicate reconstruction work. The gymnasium had fallen silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of emergency vehicles. Victoria's voice was steady, but those who knew her could hear the barely controlled emotion beneath her professional composure. 4 hours into the procedure, a hospital administrator entered my operating room. He informed me that I needed to stop what I was doing immediately to treat a wealthy donor who just arrived with chest pains. I refused. Emily would have died if I'd abandoned the surgery at that critical juncture. Dr. Peterson leaned forward, his professional interest overriding social niceties. You followed proper medical protocol. Patient in surgery takes priority over incoming cases, regardless of their social status. Victoria's smile was bitter with remembered pain. That's what I thought too. But the wealthy donor died while waiting for another surgeon to become available. His family had significant political connections, substantial influence with the hospital board, and very expensive lawyers. Tom Bradley's expression darkened with understanding. They made you the scapegoat. The hospital launched an investigation, claiming I'd violated protocols by refusing a direct order from administration. They alleged that my decision was based on personal bias rather than medical judgment. The medical board became involved. The media turned it into a story about physician arrogance, and my reputation was systematically destroyed. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Susan Martinez's sharp intake of breath. But you saved the little girl's life. That has to count for something. Emily Patterson recovered completely, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger as she reached the heart of her story. She went home to her family, started school, learned to ride a bicycle. She's now a healthy 9-year-old who plays soccer and takes piano lessons. I receive a thank you card from her family every year on the anniversary of her surgery. Henry Murphy's voice was rough with emotion. Then why did you stop practicing medicine? Victoria looked around at the faces of people who'd become her community, weighing the cost of complete honesty against the relief of finally telling the truth. Because the investigation, the media attention, the legal proceedings, they broke something inside me. I lost faith in a system that could punish someone for following their oath to do no harm. I couldn't face another surgery knowing that my medical judgment might be second-guessed by administrators who'd never held a human heart in their hands. The revelation created a wave of reactions throughout the gymnasium. Anger at the injustice Victoria had suffered, admiration for her skill and dedication, and understanding of why she'd chosen to disappear into small-town anonymity. But perhaps most significantly, it explained the competence and calm authority she'd displayed during the emergency. Dr. Peterson was the first to speak, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in rural medicine. Victoria, what happened to you was wrong. Medical ethics are clear. Patient welfare comes first, regardless of external pressures. Any physician who'd done differently would have violated their oath. That doesn't change the outcome, Victoria replied. I was stripped of my hospital privileges, my reputation was destroyed, and my confidence was shattered. I came to Millbrook to start over, to find a way to serve people without the weight of life and death decisions. Tom Bradley stood up, his fire chief's uniform still damp from the rescue operation, his expression showing the kind of determination that had made him an effective emergency coordinator. Victoria, you've just proven that you never stopped being a physician. Tonight, you saved Eleanor Patterson's life, treated dozens of injuries, and rescued 12 children from certain death. If that's not life and death decision-making, I don't know what is. The truth of his words settled over the gymnasium like a blanket of recognition. Victoria had spent 3 years trying to escape responsibility, but the emergency had drawn out the very skills and instincts she'd tried to suppress. She'd operated not as Victoria the cafe owner, but as doctor. Victoria Chen, surgeon and healer. Sarah Thompson asked the question that everyone was thinking. What happens now? Will you go back to surgery? Victoria looked around the gymnasium, taking in the organized medical station, the successfully treated patients, the evidence of what she could accomplish when circumstances demanded her best efforts. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from using her skills to save lives rather than serve coffee. I don't know, she admitted. My medical license is still valid, but practicing again would mean facing the same system that destroyed my career once before. It would mean risking everything I've built here in Millbrook. Dr. Peterson spoke up with the authority of someone who'd spent his career navigating the complexities of rural medicine. Victoria, this town has needed a younger physician for years. I'm too old to handle emergencies like tonight's, and the nearest hospital is an hour away under good conditions. If you were willing to consider staying in Millbrook as our resident physician. The suggestion hung in the air like a bridge between Victoria's past and her potential future. Practicing medicine in a small town would be vastly different from big city hospital surgery, but it would also mean using her skills to serve people who knew her character, who'd witnessed her competence under pressure, who valued her as a person rather than reducing her to a professional title. It would require rebuilding my reputation from scratch, Victoria said thoughtfully. Learning rural medicine, family practice, emergency procedures I haven't used since residency. But you wouldn't be alone, Tom Bradley interjected. Tonight proved that this community trusts you completely. We've seen what you can do under pressure, and we've seen who you really are. That's worth more than any professional recommendation. As if to emphasize his point, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez appeared at Victoria's side, still wrapped in the emergency blanket from her bus rescue. Dr. Chen, my mom wants to thank you for saving me. She said you were really brave. Victoria knelt to Emma's eye level, seeing not just a grateful child, but a reminder of why she'd become a physician in the first place. Emma, we were all brave tonight. Sometimes being brave means trusting other people to help you. As the evening wore on and the immediate crisis passed, Victoria found herself at the center of a community conversation about the future. Town council members spoke about the need for medical services. Local business owners offered support for establishing a practice, and families shared stories about medical emergencies they'd faced while driving to distant hospitals. The flood had revealed more than just the vulnerability of Millbrook's infrastructure. It had exposed the community's need for local medical expertise and Victoria's own need to practice medicine in a setting where her skills could be valued without political interference. Dawn broke gray and subdued over Millbrook, the storm having moved eastward during the night to threaten other communities. Victoria stood at the gymnasium windows, watching emergency crews assess flood damage while evacuees prepared to return to their homes. The crisis was over, but its impact would resonate for weeks or months to come. The medical station she'd established had handled 37 patients during the night, everything from minor cuts to potential heart attacks, hypothermia cases to anxiety attacks. Each successful treatment had reinforced something Victoria had been denying for 3 years. She was exceptional at emergency medicine, and people's lives were genuinely better because of her skills. Dr. Peterson approached with 2 cups of coffee that someone had brewed using supplies from Victoria's cafe. "Thought you might need caffeine," he said, settling into a chair beside her with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested extended activity. "Thank you." Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that it was stronger than she usually made it, but perfectly adequate for the circumstances. "How are you feeling?" "Last night was probably more excitement than you've had in years." Peterson chuckled, a sound tinged with both exhaustion and professional satisfaction. "Actually, it reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. There's something about emergency medicine that strips away all the bureaucracy and politics, leaves you with just the core mission of helping people." The observation struck Victoria more deeply than Peterson probably intended. For 3 years, she'd defined herself by her professional destruction, allowing the worst moment of her career to overshadow everything she'd accomplished. But last night had reminded her that medicine at its best was about competence, compassion, and the willingness to step forward when people needed help. "Dr. Peterson, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret choosing rural medicine over specialization?" The older physician considered the question while watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. 40 years ago, I could have taken a position at a major teaching hospital. More money, more prestige, opportunities to advance medical knowledge. Instead, I chose to serve a small community where I could know every patient personally. He paused, sipping his coffee while organizing his thoughts. Victoria, I've delivered 3 generations of babies, treated everything from heart attacks to broken bones, and been the person families turn to in their worst moments. That's a privilege that most physicians never experience. The trade-offs were worth it. Before Victoria could respond, Tom Bradley approached with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully managed a complex emergency. Final count, he announced. 43 people evacuated safely, 12 children rescued from potentially fatal situation, 0 serious injuries, 0 fatalities. By any measure, that's a complete success. Victoria felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. For 3 years, she'd measured success by the absence of failure. Days without medical emergencies, interactions without exposure, a quiet life without the devastating consequences that had driven her from surgery. But last night had reminded her that true success meant using her skills to make a positive difference in people's lives. Tom, there's something I need to tell you, she said, making a decision that surprised even herself. When I moved to Millbrook, I thought I was retiring from medicine permanently. I believed that my career was over, that I could never again risk the kind of responsibility that comes with holding people's lives in your hands. Tom sat down across from her, his expression showing the patient attention of someone who'd learned to listen carefully during emergencies. But last night reminded me that some obligations transcend personal comfort. Those children on the bus, Eleanor Patterson, everyone who needed medical attention, they didn't care about my past. They just needed help from someone with the skills to provide it. Dr. Peterson leaned forward with obvious interest. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Victoria took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a decision that would reshape her entire future. If Millbrook is willing to have me, I'd like to explore the possibility of establishing a medical practice here. Not cardiac surgery. That part of my career is over. But family medicine, emergency care, the kind of comprehensive medical services that rural communities need. The silence that followed was broken by Tom Bradley's quiet laughter. Victoria, after last night, this town would probably elect you mayor if you ran for office. The question isn't whether Millbrook wants you, it's whether you're ready to come back to medicine. It was a fair question. Rebuilding her medical career would mean facing the same system that had once destroyed her reputation. It would require obtaining privileges at regional hospitals, navigating insurance requirements, and submitting to the kind of professional scrutiny that had traumatized her 3 years earlier. But it would also mean using her skills in a setting where competence mattered more than politics, where patients were neighbors rather than case numbers, where the community had already witnessed her character under pressure. I think I am ready, Victoria said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like myself again. Not Victoria, the cafe owner, hiding from responsibility, but Dr. Victoria Chen using her skills to help people. Dr. Peterson extended his hand with formal gravity. Then welcome to rural medicine, Doctor. Chen, it's going to be the most challenging and rewarding work you've ever done. As they shook hands, Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar weight of old failures, but the lighter sensation of new possibilities. The woman who'd spent 3 years serving coffee was ready to serve her community in the way she'd always been meant to, as a healer. The transition from cafe owner to community physician unfolded over the following months, with the same careful precision Victoria had once brought to complex surgeries. Dr. Peterson proved to be an invaluable mentor, sharing 4 decades of experience in rural medicine while providing the connections and credibility necessary to establish a new practice. The legal and administrative requirements were daunting but manageable. Victoria's medical license required updating and continuing education credits, but her reputation from the flood response opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Hospital privileges at the Regional Medical Center in Kalispell came with references from Tom Bradley, testimonials from patients she'd treated during the emergency, and Dr. Peterson's enthusiastic endorsement. The financial aspects proved surprisingly straightforward. The cafe had been profitable enough to provide seed money for medical equipment, and the town council allocated funds for renovating the old dentist's office into a modern medical facility. Local contractors donated labor, medical equipment suppliers offered payment plans, and pharmaceutical companies provided startup inventory at reduced costs. But perhaps most importantly, Victoria discovered that rural medicine suited her temperament and skills in ways that big city hospital surgery never had. Instead of treating anonymous patients for single, specialized procedures, she became part of her patients' ongoing healthcare stories. She delivered babies, treated chronic conditions, provided counseling for mental health issues, and served as the medical authority for everything from school sports physicals to elderly care consultations. The Chen Medical Clinic opened 6 months after the flood, located in a renovated building on Main Street, just 3 blocks from Victoria's former cafe. The space included examination rooms, a minor surgery suite, X-ray equipment, and a small laboratory for basic diagnostic tests. It wasn't the high-tech environment of her former hospital, but it was equipped to handle the majority of medical issues that arose in a community of 3,000 people. Victoria's first official patient was Eleanor Patterson, the elderly woman whose heart attack during the flood evacuation had been Victoria's introduction to emergency medicine in Millbrook. Eleanor arrived for a follow-up appointment, wearing a smile that spoke volumes about her recovery. "Dr. Chen," she said, settling into the examination room with obvious comfort. "I wanted to thank you again for saving my life. The cardiologist in Kalispell said that your quick thinking during the flood prevented permanent heart damage." Victoria checked Eleanor's vital signs with the gentle thoroughness that had become her trademark, noting the vast improvement in her patient's color, energy level, and overall health. "How are you feeling, Eleanor? Any chest pain, shortness of breath, or unusual fatigue?" "Better than I have in years," Eleanor replied honestly. "The medications you prescribed are working well, and I've been following the diet and exercise recommendations you gave me. My daughter says I have more energy now than before the heart attack." As Victoria completed the examination, she reflected on the difference between her current practice and her former surgical career. In surgery, success was measured by technical precision and immediate outcomes. Did the procedure work? Did the patient survive? Were there complications? Rural family medicine required a different kind of expertise, one that valued long-term relationships, preventive care, and the ability to treat the whole person rather than just their medical condition. "Eleanor, I want to see you again in 3 months for routine monitoring," Victoria said, updating the patient's chart with notes that reflected both medical facts and personal observations. "But call me immediately if you experience any chest discomfort, and don't hesitate to come in if you have questions or concerns." The appointment concluded with Eleanor expressing gratitude that went beyond professional courtesy. "Dr. Chen, having you here in Millbrook means everything to our community. We don't have to drive an hour for medical care anymore, and we have confidence that someone with your skills is looking out for us." Similar sentiments were echoed by patients throughout Victoria's first year of practice. Jerry Collins, whose wrist fracture during the flood had been her first orthopedic case in years, brought his entire family for annual physicals. The Rodriguez family, whose daughter Emma had been rescued from the school bus, became regular patients who trusted Victoria with everything from routine immunizations to serious illnesses. Tom Bradley developed a habit of stopping by the clinic during his lunch breaks, ostensibly for blood pressure monitoring, but actually to check on Victoria's transition to rural medicine. "How's the adjustment going, Doc?" he asked during one such visit. "Miss the excitement of big city surgery?" Victoria considered the question while reviewing patient files for the afternoon. Her schedule included a prenatal visit for a first-time mother, a follow-up appointment for a diabetes patient, and a consultation about chronic back pain that had been affecting a local rancher's ability to work. "Tom, I've realized something interesting about medical practice," she said finally. "Surgery was about solving immediate, dramatic problems with technical precision. Rural medicine is about building long-term relationships and preventing problems before they become emergencies. Both are important, but this feels more sustainable." The observation reflected a deeper truth about Victoria's personal transformation. The driven perfectionism that had made her an exceptional surgeon had also contributed to her professional burnout and emotional destruction. Rural medicine required different skills: patience, continuity, the ability to see medicine as a marathon rather than a series of sprints. Her medical practice also benefited from lessons learned during her years as a cafe owner. The customer service skills she'd developed, the ability to listen carefully and respond to subtle concerns, the knack for making people feel comfortable during stressful situations, all translated directly to patient care in ways that enhanced her medical effectiveness. As Victoria's first year of practice progressed, she discovered that being the town's physician involved responsibilities that went far beyond traditional medical care. She found herself serving on the school board's health committee, advising the town council on public health initiatives, and providing medical expertise for emergency planning sessions. The role was more comprehensive than anything she'd experienced in hospital-based practice, but it also provided the kind of community integration she'd never expected to value. Instead of being anonymous in a large medical system, she became an essential part of Millbrook's social fabric. The annual Founders' Day celebration provided a perfect example of her evolving role. Victoria found herself coordinating medical coverage for the event, training volunteers in basic first aid, and providing on-site care for everything from scraped knees to heat exhaustion. But she also participated as a community member, serving coffee from a booth sponsored by her former cafe, and enjoying the festival atmosphere that celebrated Millbrook's resilience and unity. "Dr. Chen." 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez ran up to Victoria's booth with the boundless energy of a child who'd completely forgotten her traumatic bus rescue experience. "My mom says you're the best doctor in the whole state." Victoria smiled, remembering the terrified little girl who'd clung to her during the zipline rescue 18 months earlier. Emma was now a confident 9-year-old whose regular checkups showed perfect health and development. "Your mom is very kind, Emma. How's your soccer season going?" "Great. I scored 2 goals last week, and coach says I'm getting really good at defense too. Will you come watch our championship game next Saturday?" The invitation represented something Victoria had never experienced during her surgical career: personal relationships with patients that extended beyond medical encounters. In her former practice, successful surgeries led to discharge and transfer back to referring physicians. She rarely saw patients after their immediate recovery, never witnessed their long-term progress, and certainly never attended their children's sporting events. "I'll try to be there, Emma, but you know that if someone gets hurt and needs medical attention, I might have to leave the game early." Emma nodded with the solemn understanding of a child who'd witnessed Victoria's dedication to helping others. "That's okay, Dr. Chen. Helping sick people is more important than soccer games." Later that evening, as Victoria cleaned up from the festival and prepared for another week of patient appointments, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from cardiac surgery to community medicine. The career she'd thought was over had simply evolved into something she'd never known existed. Dr. Peterson, now officially retired but still serving as an informal consultant and mentor, stopped by the clinic to help with equipment inventory. At 74, he moved more slowly than before, but his mind remained sharp and his insights invaluable. "Victoria, I've been thinking about succession planning," he said, while checking expiration dates on pharmaceutical supplies. "I know you've only been practicing here for a year, but this community needs long-term stability in medical care." Victoria looked up from the patient files she'd been organizing, curious about the direction of Peterson's thoughts. What kind of succession planning? The clinic building, the equipment, the patient relationships? They need to be secured for the future. I'm 74 years old, and while I'm not planning to die anytime soon, I want to ensure that Millbrook's medical services continue, regardless of what happens to me. The conversation touched on practical issues like property ownership, equipment leases, and patient record management, but the subtext was deeper. Peterson was offering Victoria not just a job, but a legacy, the opportunity to become Millbrook's permanent physician and guardian of community health. "Dr. Peterson, are you asking me to take over the practice permanently?" Peterson's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully completed a complex, long-term project. "Victoria, I'm asking you to become the physician that Millbrook needs for the next 40 years. You've proven your competence, earned the community's trust, and demonstrated the kind of dedication that rural medicine requires." The offer represented everything Victoria had lost 3 years earlier and never expected to regain. Professional respect, community trust, the opportunity to use her skills in service of people who valued her character as much as her competence. But it also represented a complete commitment to a different kind of medical career than she'd originally planned. "I need time to think about it," Victoria said finally. "Taking over the practice would mean committing to stay in Millbrook permanently, building my entire career around serving this community." "Take all the time you need," Peterson replied. "But remember that some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. This community has embraced you completely, and you found your calling in rural medicine. Sometimes the best career moves are the ones that feel like coming home." 2 years after the flood that had changed everything, Victoria stood in the examination room of the Chen Medical Clinic, completing a routine physical for Tom Bradley. The fire chief's blood pressure was excellent. His cholesterol levels had improved since their last visit, and his overall health reflected the benefits of regular exercise and stress management techniques they'd developed together. "All good news, Tom," Victoria reported, updating his chart with current measurements and observations. "Whatever you're doing to manage job stress, keep it up. Your cardiovascular health has improved significantly over the past year." Tom grinned while buttoning his shirt. "Having a competent physician in town reduces my stress levels considerably. Before you started practicing here, every medical emergency meant either handling it ourselves or waiting for transport to Kalispell. Now we have someone with real expertise available immediately." The comment reflected a transformation in Millbrook's emergency preparedness that Victoria had helped orchestrate over the past 2 years. Advanced first aid training for volunteers, improved medical protocols for the fire department, and coordination with regional hospitals had created a healthcare system that served the community's needs while respecting the limitations of rural medicine. "Tom, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you," Victoria said, settling into her desk chair with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd found their professional home. "Dr. Peterson has offered to transfer full ownership of the clinic to me. I wanted to get your perspective as someone who represents community interests." Tom's expression shifted to the careful attention he brought to important decisions. "That's a significant step," Are you ready to commit to Millbrook permanently? It was a fair question. Taking ownership of the clinic would mean ending any possibility of returning to surgical practice, accepting that her career would be defined by rural family medicine rather than specialized procedures. But it would also mean accepting responsibility for community health in ways that provided deep professional satisfaction. I think I am, Victoria replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. 3 years ago, I thought my medical career was over. I came to Millbrook to hide from responsibility and the possibility of failure. But this community has shown me that medicine isn't just about technical procedures. It's about serving people who trust you with their lives. Before Tom could respond, Victoria's pager buzzed with an emergency alert. Motor vehicle accident on Highway 93, multiple injuries reported, ambulance response time estimated at 25 minutes. The kind of call that had once terrified her, but now triggered the calm focus of someone who'd learned to handle rural emergencies effectively. Duty calls, Tom said, recognizing the familiar pattern of emergency response. Need backup? Victoria was already grabbing her emergency medical kit, checking equipment with the automatic precision that had become second nature over 2 years of rural practice. I'll call if I need assistance. This is what we trained for. The accident scene was controlled chaos when Victoria arrived. A pickup truck had skidded on wet pavement and collided with a delivery van, resulting in 3 injured people and significant vehicle damage. Sheriff's deputies had secured the area, volunteer firefighters were managing traffic control, and the injured were conscious but requiring immediate medical attention. Victoria moved through the scene with practiced efficiency, triaging patients based on severity of injuries while coordinating with incoming ambulance crews. The truck driver had a possible concussion and lacerations that required stitches. The van driver was complaining of neck pain that suggested potential cervical injury. A passenger in the truck had an obvious arm fracture that needed immediate stabilization. "Sir, I'm Dr. Chen," she announced to the truck driver while checking his pupil response and cognitive function. "You've been in an accident, but you're going to be fine. I need to check for head injury, so I'm going to ask you some questions." The neurological assessment was normal. The lacerations were superficial, but bleeding steadily, and the patient's vital signs were stable. Victoria cleaned and sutured the wounds at the scene, using supplies from her emergency kit while explaining each step of the procedure to calm the patient's anxiety. The van driver required more complex assessment due to potential spinal injury. Victoria immobilized his neck using techniques she'd learned during her emergency medicine rotations, coordinated his transfer to the arriving ambulance, and provided detailed briefing to the paramedics about her findings and treatment recommendations. The passenger with the arm fracture received the same systematic care Victoria had provided during the flood emergency 2 years earlier. Splinting, pain management, and careful monitoring while awaiting transport to the regional hospital for x-rays and orthopedic consultation. "Dr. Chen," one of the paramedics said as they prepared to transport the patients. "Excellent job with the field treatment. The emergency department will have everything they need for immediate care." As the ambulances departed and the accident scene was cleared, Victoria experienced the familiar satisfaction that came from using her skills effectively under pressure. But more importantly, she felt the deep contentment that came from serving a community that trusted her judgment and valued her presence. Tom Bradley appeared at her side as she packed up her medical equipment. "Nice work, Doc. 2 years ago, that accident would have been a much more serious situation." Victoria looked around at the efficient emergency response, the coordinated teamwork, and the evidence of what a small community could accomplish when everyone contributed their specialized skills. "Tom, I've made my decision about the clinic ownership. If Dr. Peterson is serious about transferring the practice, I'm ready to accept that responsibility." The commitment felt right in ways that Victoria couldn't entirely explain. She'd found her calling not in the high-pressure world of surgical specialization, but in the comprehensive care of rural family medicine. The woman who'd once thought her career was over had discovered that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. Epilogue. 5 years later. Dr. Victoria Chen stood at the window of her expanded medical clinic, watching the morning sun illuminate the mountains that surrounded Millbrook. The view had become as familiar as her own reflection, marking 5 years of rural medical practice that had exceeded every expectation she'd dared to hold. The Peterson Chen Medical Clinic now occupied two buildings connected by a covered walkway, with examination rooms for routine care, a minor surgery suite for procedures that once required trips to Kalispell, and a satellite laboratory that provided rapid diagnostic services. The expansion had been funded through a combination of community investment, state rural health grants, and revenues from a practice that served not only Millbrook, but 3 neighboring communities. Victoria's patient roster included 1,847 active patients, representing every demographic from newborns to centenarians. She'd delivered 34 babies, performed hundreds of minor surgeries, treated everything from heart attacks to broken bones, and served as the medical authority for a region that had previously relied on emergency room visits for basic health care. But more importantly, she'd become an integral part of the community in ways that transcended professional relationships. She served on the school board, advised local businesses on health and safety issues, and provided the kind of medical leadership that allowed Millbrook to attract new residents and businesses. The morning brought familiar routines that Victoria had come to treasure. Coffee first, still the same Guatemalan beans she'd served at the cafe, though now prepared in her apartment above the clinic. Patient charts reviewed over breakfast, checking for follow-up appointments, medication adjustments, and the 100 small details that comprised comprehensive health care. Her first appointment was with Eleanor Patterson, now 76, and thriving 5 years after the heart attack that had introduced Victoria to emergency medicine in Millbrook. Eleanor's cardiac health was excellent. Her medications were perfectly calibrated, and her quality of life reflected the benefits of long-term medical management. "Dr. Chen," Eleanor said during her appointment, "I wanted you to know that my granddaughter Emma is graduating from high school this year. She's planning to study medicine in college, and she says you inspired her to consider rural healthcare as a career." The news provided exactly the kind of satisfaction that Victoria had learned to treasure in rural practice. Emma Rodriguez, the terrified 8-year-old who'd been rescued from a school bus during the flood, was now preparing for college with plans to return to serve her home community as a healthcare professional. "That's wonderful news, Eleanor. Emma has the intelligence and compassion to be an excellent physician. Please tell her I'd be happy to provide mentorship or recommendations for medical school applications." As the morning progressed with routine appointments, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her from cardiac surgery to community medicine. The career she'd thought was over had evolved into something she'd never known existed. Medicine practiced in service of people who were neighbors as well as patients. Healthcare delivered in the context of ongoing relationships rather than episodic encounters. Dr. Peterson, now 78 and officially retired, still visited the clinic weekly to provide informal consultation and enjoy the satisfaction of watching his successor thrive. His presence reminded Victoria that medical careers were marathons rather than sprints, measured not by dramatic individual achievements, but by sustained service to community health. "Victoria," he said during one such visit, "I've been thinking about your transformation from surgeon to family physician. 5 years ago, you thought your career was over. Now you're running one of the most successful rural practices in the state." Victoria considered his observation while reviewing patient files that represented 5 years of comprehensive healthcare relationships. "Dr. Peterson, I think I confused career advancement with professional satisfaction. Surgery was technically challenging and professionally prestigious. But this practice provides something I never experienced in hospital medicine: the opportunity to see the long-term impact of medical care on people's lives. The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's emergency pager, alerting her to a situation that required immediate attention. Motor vehicle accident on the interstate. Multiple casualties. Medical helicopter requested but weather conditions preventing flight. The kind of complex emergency that had once terrified her, but now triggered the calm focus of someone who'd learned to handle rural crises effectively. Duty calls, Doctor. Peterson observed with the understanding of someone who'd spent 40 years responding to similar emergencies. Victoria gathered her emergency equipment with movements that had become automatic over 5 years of rural practice. Some things never change. The technology gets better, the training improves, but medical emergencies still require someone willing to step forward when people need help. As she drove toward the accident scene, Victoria reflected on the physician she'd become compared to the surgeon she'd once been. Rural medicine had taught her patience, humility, and the understanding that healing involved more than technical procedures. But it had also reinforced the core principles that had originally drawn her to medicine: the privilege of serving others during their most vulnerable moments. The accident scene was serious but manageable, with Victoria coordinating triage and emergency care for 5 injured patients, while ambulance crews transported the most critical cases to regional hospitals. Her hands moved with the steady precision that had once characterized her surgical technique, now applied to emergency medicine that served her adopted community. 6 hours later, after the last patient had been stabilized and transported, Victoria returned to the clinic for afternoon appointments. The seamless transition from emergency response to routine healthcare reflected the comprehensive nature of rural medical practice, where physicians needed to be prepared for anything. Tom Bradley stopped by the clinic during his evening rounds, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd witnessed exceptional emergency medical care. Outstanding work today, Doc. 5 patients, multiple injuries, all stabilized and transported successfully. The state police commended your field management. Victoria was updating patient charts with notes from the day's emergency, ensuring that follow-up care would be coordinated appropriately. Tom, it's what we trained for. Rural medicine means being ready to handle whatever comes through the door. As the evening settled over Millbrook, Victoria completed her final patient notes and locked the clinic for the night. The building stood quiet now, but ready for whatever medical needs tomorrow might bring. Walking to her apartment upstairs, she passed the framed photo that hung in the clinic hallway, a picture from the flood rescue 5 years earlier, showing her helping Emma Rodriguez across the zip line to safety. The image served as a daily reminder of the moment when Dr. Victoria Chen had emerged from 3 years of hiding to reclaim her identity as a healer. But more than that, it represented the discovery that medicine could be practiced in ways she'd never imagined during her surgical career. Her apartment was simple but comfortable, furnished with pieces that reflected 5 years of gradual settling into a life she'd never planned but had grown to love completely. Medical journals sat beside community newsletters, pharmaceutical references shared shelf space with local history books, and her coffee table held both patient charts and invitations to community events. The phone rang as Victoria was preparing dinner, a simple meal that would fuel her for potential evening emergencies. The caller was Dr. Margaret Walsh, Director of Rural Health Services for the State Medical Association. "Victoria, I hope I'm not interrupting your evening," Dr. Walsh began, "but I wanted to discuss an opportunity that might interest you. We're establishing a new program to train physicians specifically for rural practice, and we'd like you to consider serving as a clinical instructor." The invitation represented recognition of Victoria's success in transforming from urban surgeon to rural physician, but it also suggested the possibility of expanding her impact beyond Millbrook's boundaries. Teaching other physicians how to practice rural medicine effectively could multiply her influence across the entire region. Dr. Walsh, that's an intriguing opportunity. What would the position involve? Clinical rotations for medical students and residents who are interested in rural practice. You'd provide hands-on training in family medicine, emergency procedures, and the unique challenges of serving small communities. Your background in both surgical specialization and rural medicine makes you uniquely qualified to bridge those different worlds. Victoria considered the proposal while watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Teaching had always appealed to her, and sharing her knowledge with the next generation of rural physicians could help address the nationwide shortage of medical professionals willing to serve small communities. "I'm definitely interested," she said finally. "Rural medicine has given me professional satisfaction that I never experienced in surgical practice. If I can help other physicians discover the same fulfillment, that seems like a worthwhile contribution." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering details about curriculum development, scheduling flexibility, and the logistics of combining teaching responsibilities with full-time patient care. By the time Victoria hung up, she was energized by the prospect of adding education to her professional portfolio. As night settled over Millbrook, Victoria walked through her apartment with the contentment that came from a life aligned with her deepest values. The woman who'd once thought her career was over had not only rebuilt her professional identity, but had discovered that medicine could be practiced in ways that nourished both physician and community. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source. Emily Patterson, the little girl whose heart surgery had triggered Victoria's exile from surgical practice 8 years earlier. Now 11 years old, Emily sent an annual thank you message that Victoria treasured as a reminder of why she'd chosen medicine in the first place. "Dear Doctor," Chen, the message read, "Mom says you're now a family doctor in Montana and that you help lots of people every day. I wanted you to know that I'm healthy and happy, and I still think about how you saved my life. Thank you for being brave enough to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Love, Emily." Victoria read the message twice, feeling tears that had nothing to do with sadness. Emily's surgery had cost Victoria her surgical career and her confidence in the medical system, but it had also led her to Millbrook, to rural medicine, and to a form of professional fulfillment she'd never known existed. The irony wasn't lost on her. The worst moment of her career had ultimately led to the best chapters of her life. Sometimes destruction was actually transformation in disguise, and sometimes the only way to find your true calling was to lose everything you thought you wanted. Looking out at the mountains that surrounded her adopted home, Victoria felt the deep peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The doctor who'd once served coffee had become the physician who served her community, and in doing so, had discovered that the most meaningful victories weren't about proving others wrong, but about staying true to the principles that mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to use her skills in service of others. But tonight, Dr. Victoria Chen was content to sit in her apartment above the clinic, surrounded by evidence of a life rebuilt from the ashes of professional destruction, knowing that sometimes the best journeys began with the courage to start over. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like stars against the mountain darkness, each one representing a life she'd touched, a family she'd served, a community that had embraced her completely. She'd thought she was running away from medicine when she'd arrived in this small town 5 years ago. Instead, she'd discovered that she was running toward the physician she was always meant to be. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.